Hey there.
Before I begin my main points of reasons why gun control is not net beneficial, I'm going to bring up like three main points of analysis. They're not really going to be, conforming the round into any specific definition of gun control. We discussed on Facebook what gun control was, but just for the people viewing at home, that's my first point of analysis. What we're defining gun control as inside of today's debate round, which is any further legislation that is put in place to restrict people purchasing or using guns. So we're not really talking about the current gun control system that is put in place. What we're going to be talking about inside of today's debate round is, future legislation or future laws and further regulations put in place to restrict gun purchases and gun usage. My second analysis you can write down is net benefits. Again, analysis two, net benefits. And this is sort of laid out inside of the resolution inherently, which is the standard that we should be using to judge today's debate round on is that of net benefits. Basically, whichever side of the resolution, pro or con, can prove more good than bad to be the people that win today's debate round. And then my third and final analysis you can write down is pragmatism versus idealism. Again, pragmatism versus idealism. Frequently in the gun control debate sphere, we often fall into making idealistic arguments, meaning that we make arguments but never apply it to the real world. Broken down as simply as possible, the conflict between pragmatism and idealism is the conflict between the theoretical and the conflict between the real world. It's pros contention that we should be opting for real world arguments that are applied literally and practically to the real world instead of just idealistic arguments. I feel like all of these analyses are things that both pro and con can agree on. I don't expect to be that much strife over these analyses. I feel like these are fair. And with that in mind, I'll move into my main 2 points, and then you can get into some responses to those. So my first point you can write down is point one, to err is human. Again, point one, to err is human. Gun control and the arguments that are typically made alongside it address specifically the tool that is used in a murder. It misses, however, the deeper underlying issue with gun control, which is humans themselves. The states with the lowest gun homicide rates are in order: New Hampshire, Vermont, Iowa, Idaho, North Dakota, and Montana. None of these states have any significant gun laws. None of them. The reason for that is that the people inside of these states are fundamentally different than the people in states that have higher gun rates. So instead of addressing the tools or methods that are used in a crime, we should be addressing the deeper underlying problem and look to solve the deeper problem, which is crime itself. My second point you can write down is point two, gun control doesn't work. So no, we're putting a temporary band-aid on a problem that really isn't what we should be addressing, but that temporary band-aid doesn't even work, which we can examine inside of my second point. Now I have 7 different subpoints underneath this, or 7 different real-world examples. I'm actually gonna have to get up for a second and go find those. I have them on my bed over there, but we have 7 different real-world examples of where gun control has historically, not been affected. And I'm gonna be right back, and I'm gonna go find those. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right. Sorry about that. I should have had those with me, but I left them on top of my dresser. So the first example, or the first subpoint, I have 7. I'm not going to bring up all 7 inside of the speech. Obviously, that would take up way too much time. I'll bring them up over the course of the round based on the arguments that have been presented, and probably just for the sake of bringing them up. But my first point you can write down, first subpoint underneath this is subpoint 1, Washington, D.C.'s gun ban worsened the city's homicide rate. Again, Washington, D.C.'s gun ban worsened the city's homicide. In 1967, DC implemented a law that banned citizens from owning guns, as only police officers were allowed to carry firearms. Those who already owned guns were allowed to keep them only if they were disassembled or trigger locked. Trigger locks could only be removed if the owner received permission from the DC police, which was rare. According to Jeffrey Shapiro, the results were not good. Annual homicide rose from 188 in 1967 to 364 in 1988. And then it increased even further to 454 in 1993. The gun ban was struck down by the Supreme Court in District of Columbia versus Heller, and homicides have steadily declined since then to 88 yearly murders in 2012. While Shapiro admits that there were other factors involved in the decline in homicide, lifting the gun ban clearly did not result in a rise in murders. DC still has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, and is consequently one of the most dangerous places in the country to live. But the facts clearly show that homicides in DC rose after the ban was implemented and then subsequently declined after the Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional. Now, this is all from an article. I'll post that in the comments after the debate is over. After the debate is over, you can read it over. The judges can read it over. But I'll pass the mic back to you, and you can make your preliminary arguments.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate you laying the framework. It's all pretty straightforward. So one thing I did want to mention was the way the resolution is stated. It says net benefits, so that doesn't directly link to crime specifically. I would also like to note that there are social benefits that I think could be reaped with the implementation of further gun regulation. Furthermore, you stated in the Facebook post that any change whatsoever to current gun regulation is kind of measured under the umbrella term gun control. So therefore, I took that as current practices that are in place in individual states being implemented in other states. And so with that, I guess I'll just jump into my primary argument. So I'm aware of the crime rates in the states with the with low gun control and some gun control. And what I did is I looked, and the three states that have the highest rate of murder by firearm are Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. So in these states, the average gun ownership is 47%. The average murder per 100,000 individuals is 7.6. Robbery, and I also included armed robbery and armed assault. So there are 59 armed robberies per 100,000 and 93 armed assaults per 100,000. And this is an average among the three states. Now, if you look at three states with some of the lowest, not the lowest, but some of the lowest murder by firearm rates, they include Hawaii, Rhode Island, and Iowa. Gun ownership among these three is 21%. However, the murder rate per 100,000 individuals is only 0.45 of an individual. So effectively, you need a group of over 200,000 to effectively get one murder to that number, measuring in the population. Now, the FBI, which is where I got these numbers from, they didn't publish anything regarding armed robbery or armed assault for Hawaii. But between Rhode Island and Iowa, the armed robbery rate was 10 per 100,000, and armed assault was 20 per 100,000. So I think, even though if you look at the high spectrum states, gun ownership is 2.5 times greater, but murder by firearm is almost 17 times more likely, and both armed assaults and armed robberies are nearly 6 times more common. So further, I looked into this, and again, I know that there are some states that break this rule. What I'm working on is primarily conjecture, but I do see a correlation. So there's firearm registration required in Hawaii for all firearms, long gun and handgun. I do believe there's only one other state which has handgun registry, which is New York, but that's kind of immaterial for my argument. However, in Rhode Island, Hawaii, and Iowa, you need a permit to purchase a firearm, and you need background checks for private sales in both Rhode Island and Hawaii. Where, on the other hand, in Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, as previously stated, there's no registration required for any weapon. There are no permits required to purchase a weapon, and there are no background checks for private sales. So I guess before I go on any further, I'll pass the mic back to you and see if you have anything to say regarding that.
Okay, I do have sort of a branching response to all of it. I'm really only going to have one response to that point, and it was really the main idea that I laid out inside of my first speech. I feel like all of those statistics that you mentioned really do correspond with the concept behind my arguments. The point that I was making inside of my first speech, and the point that I'm going to continue to make for the rest of the debate round, is that the issue with gun problems and the issue with mass shootings does not lie with the tool that mass shooters use. It lies with mass shooters and the psychological and mental problems that those people have. It's not an issue of regulating how those people are going to get weapons, because they're just going to get more weapons. If you look at Australia, they've completely got rid of gun violence, but their stabbing rates are completely through the roof. You get rid of one method and another method pops up. This is just a temporary solution to a problem that has really deeper underlying issues, and we need to be addressing the deeper problems instead of just focusing on the surface. And the statistics that I brought up, and I'll be happy to bring up even more inside of my next few speeches, really correlate with that, which is that gun control doesn't actually affect the overall murder rate. The whole purpose of gun control is to keep people from dying. I feel like that's something both of us can agree on. The purpose of gun control is to keep people safe. But empirically and historically, that's not what happens, because the people that are mentally deranged and not good people and not mentally safe just find other ways to hurt people. And then I have one more response, and then I'll pass it back to you. Your first analysis, as you brought up, is that the resolution doesn't relate to crime specifically when talking about the term net beneficiality. My response is that it really does. The word net beneficiality relates to everything that happens inside of it, so all of the good things and all of the bad things. Obviously, both sides of the debate round are going to have good and bad things. It's just a matter of which has more good and which has less bad. So we can talk about crime rates. It's not just gun murder rates, it's all crime rates. It has to be every good thing and every bad thing. We don't just need to look at one individual part of it. That would be an example of idealism. We need to look at the whole broad scope and look at it pragmatically through the real world. And so I'll pass it back to you, and you can make further arguments, and then I'll bring up more examples inside of my next speech.
Okay. So one thing I want to clarify is, while I do look at mass shootings as abhorrent acts, and they're terrible, and I wish that there was a simple way to mitigate the likelihood that they occur, I really don't see death by mass shooting as the primary concern, at least for my point of debate. If you look at the volume of homicides that are not related to mass shootings, that number basically makes mass shootings statistically insignificant. It doesn't mean that they're not socially significant. I mean, obviously, they're tragedies. They affect large numbers of families as well as all the residents in the area. But what I was more looking to point towards was the overall gun crime rate, specifically regarding homicides in general, not isolating it within the realm of mass shootings. And to clarify, when I speak about net benefit, and saying it's not only relating to gun crime, I also want to talk about the social ramifications involved with implementing some implementing some regulations, because there is an enormous divide between the political left and the political right, and I see it as only beneficial if we can try to take that rift and somehow minimize it. So I can carry on if you don't have anything to say regarding that yet. I can carry on with the next portion of my argument.
I mean, I have no issue with talking about social ramifications. I'd be happy to get a discussion with you about that. And I agree that the main idea behind your point wasn't about mass shootings. I don't feel like I was talking specifically about mass shooting. I was saying, gun homicide rates, they're still going to exist. In fact, homicide rates go up with significant gun legislation and further gun legislation. Oh, excuse me, all homicide rates go up with further legislation, because, crazy people are going to be crazy. Gun laws don't stop that. So you can make further arguments, and then I'll respond to those.
Okay, and I agree with that, which is why the premise for my argument really hinges around not infringing upon the rights of law-abiding Americans who possess firearms primarily for the purpose of protection. I think any reasonable discussion on this topic, it has to be inclusive of their rights, and I think it's inappropriate to lump in people who abide by the law with criminals just because they share a commonality, which is gun possession. So what I wanted to get into was that I'm a Canadian, so we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You guys have the Constitution. There might be some nuances that I don't understand, but to the best of my knowledge, the Second Amendment applies to all Americans equally until you've done something for the state to revoke that right. However, what I've noticed is that there there isn't equal regulation in every state. They have different standards. So while, from what I understand, 60% of the states that you have, there is no gun show loophole, there is no private sales loophole, but there is the remaining 40%, which do allow for basically this conversation about the gun show loophole. So I think it's not a large stretch to expect a lot of Americans to want to stand behind background checks for private sales. The reason I say this is, according to a Pew Research study in 2013, 83% of all adults, and to break that down, that's 79% of all gun owners, 86% of all people living with gun owners, and 74% of all NRA households actually do approve of background checks for private sales and gun show sales. So with that said, I think the meat of my argument is really going to rely on not so much implementing brand new regulations that are untried and untested, but are going to hinge on ones that currently exist, but raising them to a federal level so that they can be implemented equally across all states. And with that, I'll pass it back to you and see if you have anything to say about that.
Okay, and so really I believe the two arguments that you brought up inside of that speech were really hinged around, an analysis of the Second Amendment. I didn't really understand fully the point you were trying to make by talking about the Second Amendment. I don't know if you were saying that, each state has a different way of regulating it, and that's not a good thing. If you could clarify that a little bit further, I'm really sorry.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that, and that basically hinges on my first speech, which was, if you look at the 3 states with low homicide rate as opposed to the 3 states with the highest homicide rate, there are no regulations in place in, I do believe it is Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, where in Hawaii, Rhode Island, and Iowa there are. So basically, I'm a proponent of standardizing regulations nationwide as opposed to letting each state individually ascribe their regulations for gun laws.
Okay, and that sort of led into my next question, which would be what specific gun regulations you put in place. So that kind of answers my question.
Yeah.
So alternatively, I'd like to answer a question, a sort of preemptive question, or make the round a little bit more clear, because I'm talking about how we need to deal with crazy people that don't need guns and that don't need to be out in the streets hurting people. So I can't just say that without providing a solution other than gun control. So I'll provide a solution here. We need to be extending sentences for people that do bad things. The reason that things happen inside of these states that I brought up, inside of the first speech. Hold on, I forgot the states, but you probably have it on your notes. The reason that the homicide rates inside of these states were so low is because they have crazy high sentencing for criminals, and that's true across the board in the past 50 years. Crime as a whole has decreased across the country. Domestic abuse has gone down. Crime in general has gone down, and the reason for that is mainly attributed to longer sentencing for criminals. So instead of saying, no, this is a gun-free zone, or no, you can't buy this, instead we should, keep these people off the streets that do bad things. Instead of putting a Band-Aid in a problem that doesn't need a Band-Aid and the Band-Aid is just going to be bled through, we should take these people off of the streets and eliminate the deeper problem, which is crime. But you can respond to that as you please. But I'll move into some more individual arguments that you brought up. When talking about, the broad sweeping standard, this is really not something that's going to ever happen in the United States of America. I get that you're not, I don't know where you live right now. If you don't mind me asking, where, do you live in the United States currently, or do you live in Canada still?
Canada still.
Okay, cool. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the 10th Amendment specifically responds to states' rights, looking at, how states have the right to change legislation and create their own personal legislation regarding to each individual state if it's not delegated specifically to them by the Constitution. And I'm not a huge Constitution buff. You guys can probably, some of the judges and people watching at home can probably hammer me in the comment section. I'm probably dead wrong here. But from my interpretation of the Constitution, I've read through it a couple times. There is nothing inside of the Constitution that gives the government the power to create broad sweeping gun regulations. In fact, the Second Amendment kind of dispels that, as well as the 10th Amendment. So we're never really going to see, broad sweeping legislation, one size fits all legislation across the entire country for gun rights, because that's not something that's specifically delegated to the government. It's a state's issue. States are allowed to make their own rights. They're basically their own little tiny countries inside of one larger country. So they're really going to have their own pieces of legislation. But I'd like to bring up a second subpoint underneath my second point, and I'll be bringing these up contextually throughout the entire round. The second point is that the gun bans in Australia and Britain didn't work. Australia and Britain are both hailed by the left as evidence that gun control works. However, a different story, and I have two different empirical studies that prove this. The first one is a 2007 British Journal of Criminology study, and the second one is a 2008 University of Melbourne study, concluded that Australia's temporary gun ban had no effect on the gun homicide rate, meaning that it stayed the exact same. People were killing each other with guns, and they got rid of guns, yet people were still killing each other with guns. Sweeping gun regulations and getting rid of guns and putting these things in place don't really work. Gun homicide rate still remains the same, and in fact, the overall homicide rate will go up, as we've seen through the other empirical example of Washington, D.C. To quote from the Crime Research Prevention Center, quote, prior to 1996, there was already a clear downward trend in firearm homicides, and this pattern continued after the buyback. It is hence difficult to link the decline to the buyback. Again, as with suicides, both non-firearm and firearm homicides fell by similar amounts. In fact, the trend in non-firearm homicides show a much larger decline between the pre- and post-buyback periods. This suggests that crime has been falling for other reasons. Note that a change in homicides don't follow the change in gun ownership. There is no increase in homicides as gun ownership gradually increased. End quote. So that's specifically referring to Australia. I said it at the start. The gun homicide rate remained the same whenever they put these gun control regulations in place. Gun control regulations don't work, but here's the second empirical study, which is the example of Britain. This is from the Crime Research Prevention Center as well. They found that after a gun ban was implemented, there was initially a severe increase in the homicide rate, followed by a gradual decline once Britain beefed up their police force. However, there has been 1 year where the homicide rate was lower than it was pre-ban. 1 year. So the claim that a lot of people make when talking about gun rights, gun control, they don't really address the overall homicide rate. They want to look specifically at the gun homicide rate. But even if you look at the gun homicide rate, nothing really happens. And in fact, if you look at the case of Australia, it remains the exact same. The same amount of people are still killing each other with guns before and after the ban. Additionally, if you look at the example of Britain, there was an 89% spike in gun crime from 1998 to 1999, and from 1998 through 1999 to 2008 and 2009, all of which occurred after the gun ban. A closer look at the actual facts showed that the less favored example of Britain and Australia are actual examples of how gun control doesn't work. You talk a lot about how the gun homicide rate, should change in order to implement gun control policy. Not you, but people as a whole say that the gun homicide rate should change in order to enact policy. But what we see is that the homicide rate goes up and the gun homicide rate stays the exact same. And at very best, it goes down by just a little bit. So I'd be happy to let you respond to that.
Okay, so it's good that neither of us are big-time Constitution buffs. I think we'll have to let the guys in the comment section educate us. So I understand, and I mean, within the space of this debate, I guess I can't get into it too much, but I understand at least I have a cursory understanding of the 10th Amendment's claim to state rights. However, as previously stated, as the Second Amendment affects all Americans, it doesn't seem like much of a stretch that because it's an equivocal law or an equivocal right, that equivocal laws can be drawn on it. Again, maybe this is unconstitutional, and if so, then the argument has to be basically discarded. But I'll move on to say that I am in no way, shape, or form advocating for any ban of any firearm. I think we're in agreement on the notion that there are bad people, that it's in human nature to do bad things, and really, especially if you look in the United States, where I do believe there's over 300 million firearms, the idea that if we say, okay, well, we're going to take away firearms, that all the people who are breaking the law are going to say, well, I'm a murderer, I'm a rapist, but yeah, I'm definitely going to lay down my firearms for the government. I think that's a ridiculous notion, which basically will only serve to expose the American people to a risk that they shouldn't be subjected to. And it basically punishes people who will abide by such a ban, and puts them at the mercy of people who won't. And another thing that we're in agreement on is harsher penalties. And one thing that I wanted to point to, and it ties in, again, maybe it's a violation of the 10th Amendment, maybe it isn't, I don't know, but there are different state laws regarding illegal gun ownership. So some of the most lenient I've seen are misdemeanor charge, 6 months in prison, and up to, I do believe, $150 fine, where in other states there, I think it is a 5-year or a 3-year felony charge, and up to $2,500 as a fine. I want to cite Project Exile. It was done in Richmond, Virginia, I do believe in the early 90s. It was conducted over, I believe, 5 years. Rosenfield and his colleagues in the University of Missouri, they concluded that in 2005, there was a significant intervention effect for the project. Firearm homicides exhibited a 22% yearly decline, as opposed to the average 10% of other large U.S. cities. And the sample size, I do believe, was 95 large U.S. cities. So the difference is statistically significant. And what Project Exile basically implemented was a mandatory 5-year minimum sentence for individuals who are in illegal ownership of a firearm. It was also a felony charge. And while I don't know the finer details of it, I understand that anybody who is involved with providing a firearm to somebody who was not legally allowed to obtain one, they were also subject to very, very strict charges. So this is another thing that I advocate for, which is, as opposed to, again, maybe a 10th Amendment violation, but as opposed to having kind of an open for interpretation penalization of people who break the law with firearms, to have kind of a standardized one that's very harsh, and it will effectively not infringe upon the rights of legal gun owners or law-abiding citizens. It will directly target criminals, and I think that's something that both pro and con can agree on in this argument. I'll pass it back to you and see what you have to say.
Okay, I'm glad that you agree on my argument. The thing that I would implement, as opposed to, gun control, is harsher penalties for people that break the law. However, I don't really feel like this supports your side of the resolution necessarily. This is more I'm glad that you agree to my argument that I made at the start of my speech, but I don't really feel like this overall supports gun control that much. Gun control is specifically relating to any acts that restrict people, purchasing and using weaponry as a whole. I'm not sure if this entirely relates to gun control. This is something that's, regarded specifically around crime as a whole, not just specifically gun control. But I'm glad that you agree that we do need harsher penalties. But we can look at your point that you brought up about equivocal law, that it applies to all people, so you can make it's equivocal right. It applies to all people, so you can make a law that relates to all people. My response is that when a government is allowed to act, in today's modern government, the government doesn't exactly follow the Constitution that much. There's a lot of overstep throughout all of the branches of government. They've just kind of thrown it a little bit to the wayside. But but if you look at the way that it's supposed to work, the government is only supposed to pass legislation whenever the Constitution specifically gives them, the express right to do so. The president is allowed to control immigration. He's allowed to control national security. He's allowed to control the military. Recently we've seen a shift away from that. But if you look at what the government is supposed to be doing, putting, broad sweeping legislation in place on gun control is not really something that is outlined that the government should do inside of the Constitution. In fact, I'll bring up the 10th Amendment again. That is something that is related specifically to the states, which is why that we see, different legislation from state to state, because that is something that the states are allowed to do. That's not something that the government typically gets involved in. And overall, that's a better thing. But I like to bring up another example underneath my second point, a third subpoint, which is that the vast majority of shootings, occurring. Actually, before I do that, I'll respond to your point that you said that you're in no way supporting any ban of any firearm. I feel like that's kind of important to address. My response to this is I agree. I didn't want to get. I'm sorry if I got a little out of turn there. I wasn't saying that you were supporting a ban of firearms, but the point behind it still remains, which is that gun regulation as a whole doesn't work. And my third subpoint will sort of tie into this, which is looking not necessarily at bans, but in just basic regulation doesn't even work on guns. So that leads me into my third subpoint that I just brought up, which is that the vast majority of shootings occur in gun-free zones. And this is according to the Crime Research Prevention Center again. They found that since 1950, nearly 99% of mass public shootings have occurred in gun-free zones. The terror attack in Orlando, Florida, and the shooting that murdered singer Christina Grimmie in June also took place in gun-free zones. The reason is obvious. Deranged murderers want to be in a position to murder as many people as possible. So they target areas where they're least likely to find armed resistance, which happen to be in gun-free zones. As Lott points out, there are 320 million people in America, but only 602. I'm really bad at reading statistics. 100,000 police officers. So it's impossible for the police to protect everybody, which is why it's prudent for citizens to arm themselves. And that leads me into my fourth subpoint. Both of these will sort of tie into each other in a second, which is that according to the same place, there's a clear connection between a higher firearm ownership and reduced police killings. The conclusion that he came to was that there is a 3.6% decrease in police killings for every percentage point increase in those owning a firearm. Naturally, the inverse was also true. So, there's a decrease of 3.6% for the 1% less people owning guns. Lott found that from 2013 to 2015, the 6 states plus District of Columbia that banned open carry actually experienced higher rates of police death. More specifically, if you want to look at the actual statistics, 20.2 versus 17.3 per every 100,000 police officers. So, out of 100,000 police officers in the states that ban open carry, it's 20 officers. In the states that don't, it's 17.3 officers. So if you look at these two statistics, what this really points out is that putting gun regulations in place just put people, normal law-abiding citizens, at a disadvantage. And this is really the whole premise behind my case, which is that gun regulations don't stop criminals. The core principle of what a criminal is somebody that doesn't hold regard for the law. They're breaking the law. So to make the claim that putting more laws in place is going to stop them is just absurd. It's just not true, because they're already breaking the law. Why are more laws going to stop them? What's going to stop them, which is what Pro contends should be what happens, is putting longer sentencing in place. More laws preventing them from getting guns obviously doesn't stop them, and it's not going to stop them in the future. The only thing that it does, if you look at the third subpoint that I brought up, is put normal law-abiding citizens at a disadvantage, and that is not something that's good. So I'll pass the mic back to you.
Okay, that's fair. And again, it seems like it seems almost like this is more of discussion than a debate, because I think there's the vast majority of what we're talking about. We're really delegating specifics. So back to what was mentioned on Facebook, we were really talking about, or at least the way I interpreted it, was any change to the current status quo, which is why I so adamantly advocate for the things that I do. Now, sorry, if you could remind me, there was something that you contended that you said spoke against my case. Could you repeat that?
What do you mean by spoke against your case? I'm sorry.
I mentioned something. I failed to write it down when you talked about it, but you said advocating for something actually spoke against my case.
Oh, hold on. Let me look back at my flow and find that. But in response to your discussion point, this doesn't really have to be, like a formal debate. The discussion is fine. We're having a good open discussion about gun control. There are, two sides to it. I feel like this is a debate, minus a lot of the formalities. Oh, you talked about how there's a significant decline in homicide because of, them putting harsher penalties in place. I was saying that this actually supported my side of the argument and not yours. So I was sort of turning that argument on you.
Okay. What can I get to here? Yeah, so I mean, my primary argument, again, to reiterate, really focuses around trying to reduce any and all likelihood that we can see more firearms entering the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And I do identify this as gun control. There are at least it's hard to dispute, or at least I think it is. It's hard to dispute that there's absolutely no effect no measurable effect whatsoever for background checks. I also understand that there is somewhat of an issue of individuals driving to one state where there are no background checks, buying from private citizens, and then dispersing those firearms where they can. So I would really like to see this trend basically cease to exist. Like, this is why I advocate for a nationwide background check system. But we're kind of just going back and forth on the same point. So the other thing that I saw as a net benefit was, trying to bring about some repair to the social fabric of America. Like, there's such a hard division between the left and the right. And I hate the term common sense gun control, because it seems like everybody who brings it up, they have no common sense, like none. They're completely devoid of any awareness about firearms. It's quite laughable. But on the other hand, you have people on the right who say, well, I don't break the laws with firearms, and I don't know anybody who does, and therefore I don't want to see anything change with firearms whatsoever. And it seems quite often they're not really open even to the notion that, well, it won't affect you. It will just affect criminals. And it's like, well, I still don't want it, which is why this theory that I have behind the federally mandating background checks for all firearm purchases, I think, again, wouldn't disadvantage anybody who's playing on the right side of the rules. And this is, I don't think, really mandatory, but it serves to better the social fabric to some degree, is the discussion that's had about suppressors or silencers, if you're Don Lemon. And basically, I think if gun owners are smart, they will give something up without effectively giving anything up. There's this very polarizing debate about suppressors, where one side says it turns you into James Bond, and the other says no, it doesn't. So what I would propose is to look at guns at a decibel output rating. The Occupational Health and Safety Association, they rate, as long as it's not sustained, your ears are capable of receiving 140 decibels before the permanent damage is caused to them. Now, most firearm manuals suggest that you should at least wear some form of hearing protection. Other ones suggest that you should wear two forms of hearing protection, and that would be in the form of plugs and muffs over top. This is measured in an NRR rating, a noise reduction rating, and it's a logarithmic rating, so it doesn't really, the higher the number, the more the sound reduction, but it's not a standard, it's all dependent upon what the overall noise rating is. So if you're wearing two forms of hearing protection in tandem, the average deduction in decibels to an individual's perceived hearing is 14 to 20. And so the way I see it is, if we can come to some kind of agreement where we say, okay, well, like a long barrel 22 or a short barrel 22, it already fires under this 140 decibel range. So even if you're not wearing hearing protection, it will not cause hearing damage. Therefore, the argument that people need to put a suppressor on a 22 long barrel to protect their hearing, it's invalid. And furthermore, there is some evidence to suggest that it could be a risk to the public when you look at the fact that if you suppress a 22 long barrel, you fire, I think they're referred to as semi-silent rounds through it. It has a suppressor on it. You're effectively firing a weapon that is operating at a sound range of about 80 to 85 decibels. For comparison, that is about the same sound that a blender would make if it was crushing ice. So in an urban setting, it's realistic to believe that this could be a threat to public safety. It hasn't happened yet. This is more of a preemptive thing. but I really don't think a lot of gun owners would feel that bad. I have a 22 bolt action single shot. I can fire the thing in a basement, and it's not going to deafen me. It makes more noise when I'm hammering nails. But then on the other hand, if you have a 30-30, which has an average decibel output of like 165 decibels, even if you're wearing hearing protection that's appropriate, that's still very likely to cause hearing damage. So if we can look at the suppressor argument from kind of a reasonable standpoint that says, if this weapon is unsuppressed and I'm wearing hearing protection, it won't damage my hearing, then this weapon doesn't need a suppressor. We can ban those suppressors. And if you look at the other spectrum of it, if firing this weapon unsuppressed and using all appropriate hearing protection, I'm still subject to a risk, then it's more than reasonable to expect that weapon to legally be suppressed. So that's the only other gun regulation that I would advocate for. And again, it would be on a decibel basis as opposed to all suppressors or no suppressors. And that kind of ties into my fixing the social fabric. The left are happy, the right are happy. Everybody's ears are happy. Everything's kind of okay. And effectively, gun owners are giving something up without giving anything up, which was the point I made before. So I'll pass the mic back to you and basically let you take it home.
All right. I'm just gonna have two main arguments. Respond to two main arguments that you made, and then look at three main voting issues, or three things that I want the people trying to decide who should win today's debate round at home. Three things that I think this round really boils down to, and why pro wins on those arguments. So we'll first look at the argument that you made, that you talk about how longer sentencing is a form of gun control. My response to that is my point about longer sentencing wasn't saying longer sentencing for illegally purchasing a gun. It was longer sentencing for all crime in general. Because when we see longer sentencing for all crime, murder, not just murder from a gun, but murder in general, or just crime in general. If we see longer sentencing for that, we see the homicide rate, we see the gun rate, we see the gun homicide rate, we see all of that dramatically drop. So it wasn't specifically relating to gun control. That's why my advocation wasn't specifically at talking about gun control. It was more of a crime control thing and not really gun control. And that's why it really doesn't fall under the example of gun control, which is why the first point that you brought up really flows to my side of the debate round. The second thing that I want to respond to is how we need to be. It was talking about the social fabric, about how I believe the silencers or suppressors. I don't know that much about guns, honestly. I know when somebody's saying something dumb about a gun, but I don't know that much about it. But my response to this is that it would actually probably create more division. Just any gun regulations whatsoever is going to make the right unhappy, regardless of how common sense it is. Honestly, I would contest that there aren't that many common sense gun regulations.
There are.
And anytime you don't make gun regulations, it's going to make the left just as equally unhappy. So there's really no winning in this circumstance. You can say that this common sense gun regulation is going to keep both sides of the aisle happy. It's really not. They're just always going to be unhappy regardless of what happens. So that leads me into my three voting issues, or three things that I think pro should win today's debate round on. And the first one is that gun control is avoiding the underlying problem. Gun control is avoiding the underlying problem. This ties in to my first point, which is that the problem with the homicide rate being, high, and the problem with the murder rate being high is not with people having access to dangerous weapons. The problem with it is because people are doing bad things. So instead of addressing the method with how they kill people, we should be addressing the people that are killing other people. And the way they do that is through longer sentencing for all crime in general, not just purchasing a gun illegally. I don't think that should be something that has longer sentencing. Murder should have longer sentencing. The second voting issue that I bring up is that gun control doesn't work. So not only is it just a temporary solution, or not even a temporary solution, not even is it just a fake Band-Aid to a wound, it doesn't even work. I brought up, I believe it was five different subpoints of empirical cases, of real-world cases of where gun control has been implemented and where it has failed dramatically. And if you look at the second subpoint that I brought up, it was an example of where gun control was implemented, the homicide rate as a whole went up, and then it was taken away, and the homicide rate as a whole went back down. Gun control doesn't solve the problem, and in some cases, and I would argue in a lot of cases, it makes the problem worse. Which leads me into my third voting issue, which is how do we solve this? Because, Obviously, both sides of the debate round want the homicide rate to go down. And the way to solve this is for longer sentencing, not longer sentencing for purchasing a gun in Idaho when you live in Colorado, but longer sentencing for, murdering somebody or discharging your firearm at somebody or with the intent to harm them. This is the things that we need to have longer sentencing for. Gun control is just a restriction of Americans' rights that doesn't really solve the problem. It ignores the deeper underlying problem with the system as a whole. It ignores the deeper underlying problem with Americans as a whole. It's not safe.